Hey everybody, this is a piece titled On Some Deceptive Quote Reasoning of the Hamas Compatible Left. It's by Yves Coleman. Sorry, the footnotes on this page. Okay, sick. There's footnotes. So thank you, Yves Coleman. I appreciate it. I've tried to summarize below some of the main quote arguments circulating within the Hamas compatible left. For years, this left has tried to hide the anti-working class and anti-communist character of the various tendencies of political Islam and Muslim fundamentalism. See the article Hamas, a black hole for the left and the international quote left. Question mark on workers' liberty. Bunch of citations in French. Of course, these sophisms are not carved into stone. Depending on the circumstances, the same arguments can sometimes be abandoned by their supporters, sometimes fiercely defended, and they do not stem from any coherent historical and political reflection, at least not from the point of view of the struggle against capitalist exploitation. What has been most striking since the 7th of October of 2023, although it obviously began long before this mass massacre, is the ideological and ethical convergence, usually unacknowledged, between, quote, progressive academics, far-left groups, anti-Zionist Jews, and associations, quote, supporting Palestine, a convergence that aims to excuse the crimes of Hamas, since they were and will be committed, as the case may be, by, quote, resistance fighters, quote, colonized people, or even by the entire Palestinian, quote, people. Let's be clear, any denunciation of Israeli war crimes, at least 18,000 dead and tens of thousands injured on the 15th of December 2023, any denunciation of Israeli war crimes that plays down the significance of the anti-Semitic massacre of the 7th of October is tantamount to Holocaust denial, even if it is cloaked in a, quote, left or, quote, feminist veneer. Footnote, as in this, quote, feminist article, which equates the police expulsion from France of a Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine activist whose organization has murdered some 30 Israeli civilians since 2005, with the rapes committed by Hamas or other jihadist militants on the 7th of October 2023, and above all denies the very reality of these rapes. And footnote. 1. Gaza is said to be a concentration camp, implying that the Israelis, or at least their army and government leaders, are Nazis or act like Nazis. Footnote. To quote only two examples, on the 3rd of December and December 9th, 2023, Izzat al-Rizq, member of the political bureau of the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, denounced repeatedly to Sahal as a, quote, Nazi army, criticizing, quote, this narrative and others that the Nazi occupation has been repeating since its violation of the truce agreement, end quote. And, quote, the horrific massacres committed by the Nazi occupation army against the innocent and defenseless civilians of our people in Gaza, end quote. There is a deliberate confusion here between concentration camps and mass murder centers, a distinction that few left-wing activists or sympathizers make, either through calculation or ignorance. Hence, for example, the comparisons between the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943 and the mass slaughter perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October. Footnote. According to Norman Finkelstein's statement broadcast on his official Substack on the 7th of October 2023, quote, for the last 20 years, the people of Gaza, half of whom are children, have been immersed in a concentration camp. Today, they breach the camp's walls. If we honor John Brown's armed resistance to slavery, if we honor the Jews who revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto, then moral consistency commands that we honor the heroic resistance in Gaza. End quote. End footnote. The Nazification of Israel is at the heart of this, quote, argument, and most of the left and far left, quote, reasoning, whether this Nazification is admitted, half confessed or denied by its supporters. The soft version, Gaza would be a, quote, open-air prison, end quote. Footnote, a term widely used on the left from the Trotskyist Lutte Ouvrière, Nathalie Arthaud, to the Greens' Eva Joly, for example, during the 2012 presidential campaign. And footnote, Nazification means genocide, so we hear more and more from the Hamas-friendly left that Israel is preparing or is in the process of carrying out a genocide against the Palestinians. In line with its Nazification of the Israeli state, the Hamas-compatible left puts forward the idea that this state is carrying out a, quote, genocidal policy, end quote. Thus, the Tzedek, quote, decolonial Jewish collective, end quote, wrote on the 17th of October 2023, the, quote, statements of the highest political authorities of the Israeli state regarding the military offensive underway in Gaza leave no doubt as to their genocidal intentions, end quote. While, quote, ethnic cleansing is underway in Gaza, we speak out as Jews of France to refuse to allow this genocide to be carried out in our name, end quote. The UJFP, the Union Juive Française pour la Paix, I have no idea if I'm saying that right at all, probably saying it very wrong, French Jewish Union for Peace took the same line when on the 18th of October 2023, its national coordination stated, quote, we support them, if not now, and Jewish for Peace. I don't know if there's a typo here. We French Jews whose word is muzzled by our government, and we repeat with them, quote, no genocide in our name, end quote, end quote. On the Trotskyite compatible academic, Thierry Labica, on the Contre-Temps website, I have no idea if I'm saying that right again, and in L'Anticapitaliste, joined the libertarian Freddy Gomez of the A Contre-Temps website in evoking the former, a, quote, enterprise of a genocidal nature, a, quote, unquote, a, quote, exterminationist, end quote, policy, and the latter, the, quote, obsessive question, end quote, formulated in the best and most accurate way, end quote, by the journalist Daniel Schneiderman. Quote, how can we admit that the descendants of the victims of genocide less than a century later are themselves practicing genocide? End quote. It says that on the main Trotskyist website, International Viewpoint, Thierry Labica is a lecturer in British Studies at the University of Nanterre and a member of the NPA, which I think is like Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste or something like that. Wikipedia says Daniela Schneiderman, born 1958, is a French journalist who focuses on the analysis of televised media. Danielle Schneiderman is mainly active in weekly columns in the past in Le Monde. and presently in Libération and on a video channel, Arrêt sur Image, Freeze Frame, formerly broadcast by the public TV channel France 5, but currently financed by subscription. The television show was cancelled in 2007 by France 5 direction, an incident that led to the creation of Arrêt sur Image website. The Arrêt sur Image website. Back to the text. Unfortunately for our radicals tortured by an existentialist doubt, the Stalinist de-selfer already answered their, quote, obsessive question in 1980, quote, such is the irony of history. The Zionist leaders of Israel are pursuing the same genocidal policy towards the Arabs as the Hitlerites pursued against the Jews, end quote. De-selfer in the book The Collapse of Zionist Theories, published in 1980. Footnote. See Stan Crook's article, The Stalinist Roots of Left-Wing Anti-Semitism, published at Workers' Liberty. Back to the text. They are good in company. Since the Trotskyite-compatible academic Gilbert Ashkar, who has been struggling for years to seriously criticize Hezbollah and can only characterize Hamas as a, quote, fundamentalist movement, end quote, with a, quote, magical thinking, end quote, denounced on the 28th of November 2023, quote, the Zionist genocidal war and its accomplices, end quote, and possible, quote, refugee camps that would serve as concentration camps under the supervision of the Israeli army, end quote. Gilbert Ashkar. Check out the critique of Gilbert Ashkar's book on the Gaza War by Barry Finger. It was kind of like an American version of the like third camp Trotskyism in Britain. Very much focuses on left-wing anti-Semitism. I would say third camp Trotskyism, to the extent that it exists in the United States, does not do that very much at all. And especially does not analyze left-wing anti-Semitism, particularly as it pertains to Israel at all. I would say Barry Finger, and maybe there's others, is a notable exception to that. What the hell is that? I wanted to look something up. I wanted to look up de-selfer. Anyway, I can't find anything. Also, footnote, see Ashkar's article 11 Theses on the Resurgence of Islamic Fundamentalism. To respond to these twisted, quote, arguments and falsely naive questions, one need only quote the historian Philip Spencer. Philip Spencer being a third camp Trotskyist, or at least coming out of third camp Trotskyism in the UK. He's closely affiliated, for instance, with Robert Fine. He's written a lot on anti-Semitism and on the political importance of cosmopolitanism. He's dead now, but Philip Spencer and Robert Fine were on the Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism network, which had people like Moishe Pistone, Werner Bonafelt, Marcel Stutzler, Lars Fischer, Gerhard Scheidt was on there, and so on. But anyway, that's who Philip Spencer is. And here's the quote. Quote, the accusation of genocide against Israel betrays a deliberate refusal to acknowledge that Hamas has openly stated its genocidal intentions. This accusation is anti-Semitic since it accuses the Jews of the crime committed against them, ... It has its origins in a partial and limited at best understanding of the Shoah as having only a universal significance from which it is claimed only the Jews have not learned the lessons. And we quickly come to Israel, the new Nazi Germany. There is ... a kind of perversion, a pleasure in imagining victims transformed into executioners ... It's certainly hard not to sense a certain excitement in the way the demonstrators hurl slogans so offensive to the Jews that they plunge them into a state of anxiety that they haven't experienced in this country for ages. End quote. Philip Spencer. End footnote. To appeal to American public opinion, the Hamas-friendly left finds it is clever to glorify the murder of civilians by John Brown and Nat Turner in the 19th century. This is the case, for example, of Norman Finkelstein, who rejoiced at the 7th of October 2023, citing the rebellions of John Brown and then the following day Nat Turner, and even the hostages of the Paris Commune! Exclamation point. Footnote. Here is how Finkelstein expressed his joy. Quote, I, for one, will never begrudge. On the contrary, it warms every fiber of my soul. The scenes of Gaza's smiling children as their arrogant Jewish supremacist oppressors have finally been humbled. The stars above in heaven are looking kindly down. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The souls of Gaza go marching on. End quote. For more details, particularly on Finkelstein's bad faith, see his interview with Piers Morgan. And my article, Norman Finkelstein, it's something in French. Not translated. And I won't bother you with that. Oh, there's a footnote that I missed. Adulated by the far left, invertebrate anti-Zionists, Finkelstein accuses Jews of making money out of Judaicide. And on the pretext of being, quote, humorous, he spreads anti-Semitic cliches based on false statistics. See Alan Johnson's article, Denial, Norman Finkelstein, and the New Antisemitism, which is on this channel. I'm far from sharing Johnson's position on every issue, but I share many of his criticisms of Finkelstein. End footnote. These absurd analogies and historical references to the fight against slavery in the United States and to the murder of Euro-American civilians by slaves, Nat Turner, and by the Euro-American anti-slavery activist John Brown, demagogically allow everyone to be presented with a false choice. Either you are an abolitionist or you support slavery, or to take the example of the Commune, you are with the Communards or with the Versailles. Or with, I think it's probably translated as Versailles. More accurately, but that's okay. At least that's how English would say it. I've never heard the Versailles referred to. Anyway, this is one of the favorite techniques of the identitarian left in the United States and elsewhere to discredit its opponents. Either you think as exactly as the identitarian left or you support, quote, structural racism, end quote, and are with the, quote, white supremacists, end quote. And since the, quote, white supremacists, end quote, Itamar Ben-Gvir's extreme right are in power in Israel, and the 750,000 or so settlers in the occupied territories in Jerusalem are also supported by the, quote, white supremacists, end quote, who carry out, quote, pogroms, end quote, against Palestinians, the link with Israel and Palestine is immediate. The Hamas-friendly left is not blind to the war crimes or crimes against humanity committed by other states. It simply thinks that these crimes are not important compared to those of Israel. In fact, In fact, their importance is literally, quote, infinitesimal, end quote, exclamation point. Footnote. This is a quote, the crime committed by Hamas is absolutely infinitesimal compared to what is happening in Gaza, end quote, said left-wing journalist and essayist Sylvain Sipel on the 12th of December 2023. End footnote. The willful blindness of the Hamas-friendly left is particularly supported by the, quote, arguments of the, quote, decolonialists, end quote, of all sorts. Three, Hamas rockets are not missiles. However, according to the Yemeni governmental press agency SABA, which reproduces the communiques of the Al-Qassam brigades and all of Hamas leaders, the latter are indeed sending salvos of, quote, missiles towards Tel Aviv in response to the Zionist massacres against civilians, end quote. These rockets are not meant to kill, but, quote, only to terrorize the population. And in any case, Israel is well protected against rockets and missiles because, quote, the Israeli army is one of the strongest and best equipped in the world, end quote, is a, quote, Goliath against the Palestinian, quote, David, etc. 4. Armed resistance is legitimate and the only solution. The UJFP wrote on the 7th of October, quote, we support the resistance of the Palestinian people in the face of the occupation, oppression, and denial of Palestinian rights, end quote. However, on the 7th of October, this organization was more cautious than Norman Finkelstein, stating that it did not have, quote, detailed and verified information, end quote. It also said that not all of its members necessarily supported Hamas's strategy. However, on the 12th of October 2023, the UFJP was more specific, quote, for the Palestinians and in particular the Gazans and occupied people under Israeli domination, resistance, whether armed or not, is legitimate, end quote. There's a footnote that I missed. Israel, whose army recently covered up the pogroms carried out by settlers against Palestinian villages, end quote, according to the UJFP, which obviously refrains from using the term, quote, pogrom in connection with the massacres of the 7th of October. End footnote. This reasoning is similar to that of Hamas, according to which traditional forms of struggle are doomed to failure because peaceful demonstrators are shot and killed by the IDF. Parenthesis, the IDF murders, that no one can deny, end parenthesis. To put it plainly, Hamas is not really responsible for its crimes of the 7th of October 2023, since, quote, the civilian victims are the result of decades of oppression, looting, and murder by a colonial Israeli regime that wants to keep the natives submissive, end quote. But, quote, massacres of civilians, whoever they may be, are unacceptable, end quote. UJFP. So on the one hand, the mass murders of the 7th of October are, quote, unacceptable, but on the other hand, they are somehow inevitable because in reality it's not Hamas that is, quote, defending itself, end quote. Quote, it is the occupied, colonized, besieged people, end quote. Footnote, we find the same notion of inevitability in Thierry Labica's article on Contretemps website on the 13th of December. According to Thierry Labica, quote, Hamas must be recognized for the historical role of social organization and legitimate, pragmatic, and political interlocutor that it has been absolutely and catastrophically denied, end quote. And, quote, 7th of October is the product of this denial, end quote. End footnote. New section. Admire the sleight of hand. Excuse me. No, I think that's just in caps. Never mind. Admire the sleight of hand! Exclamation point. This is what Hamza Hamushen wrote on the Contratemp website, linked to the Trotskyist NPA, on the 9th of November 2023, mixing up everything from the armed struggles for national liberation in Algeria and Vietnam with the struggle of Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver. He asserts, quote, denouncing and pointing the finger at the violence of the oppressed and colonized is not only immoral, it is also racist. Colonized peoples have the right to resist by any means necessary, especially when all political and peaceful means of protest have been blocked or destroyed. End quote. Hamza Hamushen is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, commentator, and founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign, ASC, and Environmental Justice North Africa. Back to the text. The trick is the same because it makes it possible to avoid mentioning the fact that Hamas has a program to multiply massacres like the 7th of October 2023 pogrom until Israel is annihilated, as Ghazi Ahmad, a member of the Hamas Political Bureau, has declared in an interview with Lebanese television station LBCI News. Where am I? Yeah, I can't find anything for this person. Footnote. I had a friend who speaks Arabic check the authenticity of the translation. This site and the association that funds it are run by former senior FBI official Oliver Revell. He makes no secret of the fact that he creates them with the agreement of the Israeli Secret Services, and his website also makes no secret of the fact either. It's a link to memory.org. End footnote. The same kind of, quote, reasoning can be found in the press release of the 10th of October 2023 from the, quote, Tzedek Decolonial Collective, end quote, which states, quote, resistance, including armed resistance, is legitimate in a context of oppression and denial of the fundamental rights of a people, ... It is the colonial structures and policies, largely intensified by the Israeli government in recent months, that produce systematic and daily violence against the Palestinians, ... It is the colonial structures and policies, largely intensified by the Israeli government in recent months, that produce systematic and daily violence against the Palestinians. The violence is bound to rebound on the Israeli population, which the colonial regime enlists in the war and colonization, end quote. The mass massacre of the 7th of October was therefore a, quote, a mere, quote, ricochet for our, quote, decolonialist, end quote, and for Hamas. What's more, it's interesting that these so-called advocates of armed revolution, 3,200 kilometers away from their cozy nest, never consider including ... Israeli Jewish fighters in this, quote, exemplary struggle, end quote. Excuse me, I fucked that up. What's more, it's interesting that these so-called advocates of armed revolution, 3,200 kilometers away from their cozy nest, never consider including ... Israeli Jewish fighters in this, quote, exemplary struggle. As the Brazilian collective Passa Palavra writes, even though it considers, quote, Zionism to be a form of, quote, fascism, end quote, question mark, exclamation point, quote, at the same time as the Israeli government was ordering the population of northern Gaza to flee, Hamas was trying to dissuade the population from fleeing, claiming that this was Zionist psychological propaganda and calling on people to stay at home. Indeed, the civilian population bombed by the Israeli army in their homes, schools, and hospitals is the indispensable human shield behind which Hamas protects itself. There could be no more timely rebuttal to the hypocrisy of the left, which assumes that there is an identity of interest between Hamas and the Palestinian people, yet both sides share the same contempt for civilians. Hamas has chosen a method of attack that is totally indifferent to the fate of the Palestinian people. It is not only terrorism in the way Hamas has killed and abducted civilians, it is also terrorism in the way it exposes a population that is unable to defend itself against Israeli bombardment. Historically, the guerrilla method has been used in such circumstances, but this will require close relations with Israelis who oppose apartheid, which Hamas does not do because it is deeply racist. In other words, it is not anti-Zionist, it is anti-Semitic. Hamas chooses a method of struggle that exposes and sacrifices the Palestinian population. End quote. Passa Palavra. I was trying to find something for Passa Palavra, but I couldn't find it. 5. The Israeli government is a white supremacist, racist, fascist, and even fascist government. I think there might be a typo there. Therefore, any means can be used to fight it as long as this fight is waged, quote, in accordance with international humanitarian law, end quote. Footnote. See, for example, the AFPS press release of the 7th of October denouncing a, quote, extreme right-wing racist and supremacist Israeli government, end quote. Or the article by Thierry Labica in Le Anticapitaliste number 150, published by the Trotskyist NPA number 1, which refers to, quote, 30 years of increasingly right-wing theocratic and fascist involution, end quote, and a, quote, apartheid state in full supremacist and theocratic drift, admired by all of the extreme right, end quote, and a, quote, proven fascist power, end quote. Labica's thesis is not very new one, since the American Stalinists, among others, already denounced Zionism as fascist almost a century ago. Indeed, in the Yiddish-language Stalinist press published in the United States, Kalman Marmur wrote in 1936 that in Palestine, quote, the situation of the Jews there is even more dangerous because of Jewish fascism, the Zionist movement that has put Palestinian Jews, and also the term, quote, Jewish people, end quote, end parenthesis, in the service of English imperialism in order to oppress the Arab workers and peasants, end quote. And N. Krupkin denounced the, quote, fascist Zionists, end quote, in 1931, quoted in Henry Srebnick's article titled, quote, An Enemy of the Jewish Masses, the ICOR and the Campaign Against Zionism, 1924 to 1935, published in A. Grabsky's A. Grabsky's book, edited volume, Rebels of Zion. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, the Palestinian people have a legitimate and indisputable right recognized by international law to organize their resistance, including armed resistance, as long as it complies with international law, end quote. AFPS, November, not sure. I don't know if it's October 11th or November 10th, 2023. And footnote. There is also a hypocritical variant of this argument. We don't have to tell the exploited/colonized how to fight. The Nazification of the current government is often extended to all Israeli governments since 1948 and even to the leaders of the Yishuv before the creation of the state, ... Just type the words, quote, Zionism and, quote, fascism in any search engine, and you will find an impressive number of academic contributions, not just from the far left, supporting this thesis. Footnote. For example, Pierre Stambel of the UJFP lumps together various, quote, companionships, end quote, throughout history. One gets the impression that Zionism, all Zionism's tendencies, fascism and Nazism have always been buddies from the 20s to the present day. Two examples. Stambel talks about Jabotinsky's fascist temptations while, quote, forgetting, end quote, to point out that his supporters contacted Ben Hecht to persuade him, against the majority of Jewish organizations, to launch the biggest mass campaign against Nazism in the United States before World War II. A campaign which was subsequently taken up and conducted by the left and far left of the time. See Ben Irwan's book, The Collaboration, Hollywood's Pact with Hitler, 2013. Who's Ben Hecht? Wikipedia says Ben Hecht lived from 1894 to 1964 and was an American screenwriter, director, producer, playwright, journalist, and novelist. A journalist in his youth, Ben Hecht went to write 35 books, and some of them almost enjoyed screenplays and plays in America. Ben Hecht received screen credits alone or in collaboration for the stories or screenplays of some 70 films, including 6 Academy Award nominations and 2 wins. After graduating from high school in 1910, Hecht ran away to Chicago, where in his own words he, quote, haunted streets, whorehouses, police stations, courtrooms, theater stages, jails, saloons, slums, madhouses, fires, murders, riots, banquet halls, and bookshops, end quote. Sounds pretty punk rock. In the 1910s and 1920s, Hecht became a noted journalist, foreign correspondent, and literary figure. In the late 1920s, his co-authored report-themed play, The Front Page, became a Broadway hit. The Dictionary of Literary Biography, American Screenwriters, calls Ben Hecht, quote, one of the most successful screenwriters in the history of motion pictures, end quote. Ben Hecht received the first Academy Award for Best Story for Underworld. Many of the screenplays he worked on are now considered classics. Ben Hecht also provided story ideas for such films as Stagecoach. Film historian Richard Corliss called him, quote, the Hollywood screenwriter, end quote, someone who, quote, personified Hollywood itself, end quote. In 1940, Ben Hecht wrote, produced, and directed Angels Over Broadway, which was nominated for Best Screenplay. Ben Hecht was an active Zionist after meeting Peter Bergson, who came to the United States near the start of World War II. Motivated by what became the Holocaust, Hecht wrote articles and plays such as We Will Never Die in 1943 and A Flag is Born in 1946. Thereafter, he wrote many screenplays anonymously to avoid a British boycott of his work in the late 1940s and 1950s. The boycott was a response to Hecht's active support for paramilitary action against British mandated Palestine forces, during which time a Zionist forces supply ship to Palestine was named the SS Ben Hecht. In 1954, Hecht published his highly regarded autobiography, A Child of the Century. According to it, he did not hold screenwriting, in contrast to journalism, in high esteem, and never spent more than 8 weeks on a script. In 1984, 19 years after his death, Ben Hecht was posthumously inducted into the American Theater Hall of Fame. Back to the text. Pierre Stambul also, quote, forgets that the same Jabotinsky, despite his extreme right-wing convictions, while calling for the construction of a, quote, steel wall, end quote, against the Arabs, was opposed to an exclusively, quote, Jewish state. Quote, in fact, Jabotinsky did not have the anti-Arab vision of the Netanyahu family. In 1940, Jabotinsky envisioned a state of Israel, quote, a dominion of the British Empire with a Jewish majority, a Jewish president, and an Arab vice president, and where all citizens would be equal regardless of their origins or religion. The Jewish and Arab communities, as and their respective languages, should have an identical status recognized by law. End quote. As early as 1929, Jabotinsky had published a poem that envisioned a Jewish state on both banks of the Jordan, and in which he wished that in the 21st century, quote, the Arab, the Christian, and Jew will prosper from the wealth of our land, end quote. According to Charles Enderlin, a journalist with little suspicion of sympathy for the Israeli far right. But most, quote, anti-Zionists, end quote, despise the complexity of history, preferring amalgams and sloppy shortcuts. End footnote. Just type the words, quote, Zionism and, quote, fascism into any search engine and you will find an impressive number of academic contributions, and not just from the far left, supporting this thesis. Thus, the Hamas-friendly left quotes a sentence written in October 1938 by Heinrich Ehrlich, a Bund leader, but obviously, quote, anti-Zionist, and, quote, provide no quotes from surviving Bund activists after the Judeicide or after the creation of Israel. That's another thing, is that when people say, just as people like kind of, especially anti-Zionists, I would say collapse Zionism into like a very homogenous thing. So do they generally collapse their anti-Zionism into, or the anti-Zionism of like the Bund, or like pre-Israel's existence anti-Zionism, or the critique of Zionism as a strategy for Jewish emancipation, with anti-Zionism full stop. Which the anti-Zionism of like the Jewish Labor Bund, or people who were just kind of disinterested in like Jewish people who were like Jewish like leftists who were disinterested, not just leftists but other people who were pretty disinterested in like Jewish identity, prior to the Holocaust especially. Their critiques or their anti-Zionism or their indifference to Zionism or their like opposition to that goal as a means of achieving emancipation and security, I think especially security for Jews, is not the same as just is not like does not encompass the full scope of what anti-Zionism entails. Anyway, Wikipedia says Henrik Ehrlich lived from 1882 to 1942 and was an activist of the General Jewish Labor Bund in Poland, a member of the Petrograd Soviet, and a member of the Executive Committee of the Second International. Back to the text. Footnote, quote, the destiny of Zionism is closely tied to the destiny of fascism and anti-Semitism, against which the Jewish working class must struggle in a life-or-death fight, end quote. Quoted in Jack Jacobs' article, Bundist Anti-Zionism in Interwar Poland, published in the edited volume Rebels Against Zion. End footnote. The Havara agreements between the Nazi regime and the Zionist leaders of the Jewish Agency of June 1933, which allowed wealthy German Jews to transfer capital to Palestine, above all to save the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. Always an emphasis on this, never an emphasis on Haj Amin al-Husseini's actual collaboration with the Nazis. Or the Stalinist collaboration with the Nazis, for that matter. Only with this agreement. Wikipedia says the Havara Agreement, transfer agreement, was an agreement between Nazi Germany and Zionist organizations signed on the 25th of August 1933. The agreement was finalized after 3 months of talks by the Zionist Federation of Germany, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, under the directive of the Jewish Agency and economic authorities of Nazi Germany. It was a major factor in making possible the migration of approximately 60,000 German Jews to Palestine between 1933 and 1939. The agreement enabled Jews fleeing persecution under the new Nazi regime to transfer some portion of their assets to British Mandatory Palestine. Immigrants sold their assets in Germany to pay for essential goods manufactured in Germany to be shipped to Mandatory Palestine. The agreement was controversial and was criticized by revisionist leader Zev Jabotinsky and by some non-Zionist Jews, as well as by members of both the Nazi Party and the German public. For German Jews, the agreement offered a way to leave an increasingly hostile environment in Germany. For the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, it offered access to both immigrant labor and economic support. For the Germans, it facilitated the emigration of Jews while breaking the anti-Nazi boycott of 1933, which had mass support among European and American Jews and was thought by the German state to be a potential threat to the German economy. So like this agreement emphasized, right, in which this is a very serious time. People don't, this is another thing about the Yeshuv, is that the left in general is very sympathetic to the immigrant experience, right? In general, right? And they generally they take they're very conscientious of like the suffering and the injustices and the problems that would motivate people to leave places, whether that be economic distress or being a refugee from some kind of other crisis, war, and so on, but not in the case of Jewish immigration or Jewish people leaving places to go to Israel, as if it was just like a fun vacation where they could dominate the local population. It's often, I mean, I'm not saying this is Coleman's view at all. It's probably not. But it's like almost like they're just like the desire to move to Israel and have a Jewish state was just some kind of like vacation and opportunity for exploitation. Um, but yeah, and the other thing that I think with this all the time that I always think is like, yeah, not talking about like the Nazi collaboration of Husseini, who helped organize Muslim SS divisions, which did exist. So this kind of collapsing of anti-Semitism into just like um, uh, obviously like in the German, there's a German hierarchical mind, racial hierarchy and stuff like that. But to reduce like anti-Semitism to um, just broader like anti-non-Christian attitudes, especially in the case of the Nazis, is mistaken. The other thing that I think is important, and I say this, I've said this before, is that, and I'm not an expert on this, but I do know that obviously people like Marcus Garvey had talks with the Klan voluntarily to support his Back to Africa movement, and also that the Nation of Islam, from which, and I think I'm not exactly sure, but I think like during the period of Malcolm X's involvement in the Nation of Islam, which was for most of his political career, I think he was out of the Nation of Islam for less than a year, maybe 2 years before he was assassinated in '65. I think that's the year he was assassinated, off the top of my head. Um, but there's not really much criticism of that, right? There's not really like criticism of like white supremacists and black nationalists really sitting down and having a talk when the situation was not nearly as desperate as when the Nazis actually took power in Germany. Um, Marcus Garvey and the Nation of Islam, especially, or Malcolm X especially, who again said, who again, like I just said, was spent most of his political life uh, as a member of the Nation of Islam, um, which he only broke because he, with not for ideological reasons above all, but because he thought that Elijah Muhammad was a fraud. Because he was. Because he preached a lot of morality, and I think he was having sex with a lot of people in the Nation of Islam. That's my understanding. That's my memory of Malcolm X's autobiography. Um, but yeah, this just the just this is just I just find this, not to talk about my feelings, but I find this a particularly upsetting development. This kind of like, yeah, the Nazis and the Zionists work together. Um, yeah, and other obviously people say other bogus shit. Like Netanyahu said, like Hitler got the idea to kill the Jews from the Arabs, which is also insane. Um, anyway, sorry, I got sidetracked here, and I know you don't. No one wants to hear what I'm saying here. I'm just riffing to myself. Um, yeah. So where the hell am I? Um, uh, shit. Sorry. Thus, the Hamas-friendly left quotes a sentence written in October 1938 by Heinrich Ehrlich, a Bund leader, but obviously, quote, anti-Zionist, and, quote, provide no quotes from surviving Bund activists after the genocide or after the creation of Israel. The Havara agreements between the Nazi regime and the Zionist leaders of the Jewish Agency in June 1933, which allowed wealthy German Jews to transfer capital to Palestine and, above all, to save the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. The official presence of Zionist organizations in Germany before the Second World War, or even worse, the fact that, quote, Zionists, and, quote, did not resist against the Nazis in Europe, which I'm pretty sure is just blatantly false, because to my understanding, many of the people who were involved in in like, let's say, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising were labor Zionists. Um, Also, as a side note, uh, uh, the Stalinists, the Red Army, the Soviet Union, at least to my understanding, essentially let the Warsaw Uprising be destroyed. Did not come to its aid. And there's various reasons why people say that happened. Not being interested in sharing power with the instigators of the armed uprising. But yeah, I do know that the fact that and also just people who were in partisan units and shit like that in say Poland and stuff like that who were Jewish were often labor Zionists. But yeah. Footnote, quote, "We know that the instrumentalization of the Nazi genocide by the Zionists is a fraud. The Zionists played only a very small role in the Jewish resistance to Nazism. Some of their leaders were deeply involved with Nazism," end quote. UJFP. This fable corresponds almost word for word to that told by a famous Soviet Stalinist writer, Vergelis. Quote, "At the fatal hour, Zionism kept aloof, unconcerned for the destiny of the Jewish people as a whole. Zionists came into contact with the Hitlerites at the time when all major public and political trends had united against fascism," end quote. Aaron Vergelis, A Traveler's Encounters, Articles, Speeches, Travel Notes, Interviews, and Letters of a Jewish Poet, published in Moscow, 1988. Quoted in Gennady Estrak's article, An Opportunist Anti-Zionism, Sovietisch Heimland, 1961 to 1991, published in Rebels Against Zion. I really need to read that book. End footnote. All this without ever providing element of the famous, quote, context, end quote. A context that never allows this Hamas-compatible left to get away with the mass murder organized by Hamas. A context that nevertheless allows this Hamas-compatible left to get away with the mass murder organized by Hamas on the 7th of October, 2023. ... Footnote, to understand the extent to which the use of the word, quote, context has become a convenient smokescreen for tolerating anti-Semitism, one only need hear what the Harvard University, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania had to say when asked by a Republican Party representative on the 5th of December 2023 whether, quote, calling for the genocide of Jews violated the code of conduct of harassment, end quote, at their universities. The three presidents replied in unison that it, quote, depended on the context, end quote, and, quote, whether it was directed against an individual, end quote, exclamation point. That shit is painful to watch. How they're just is that anti-Semitic? Well, it depends. I feel like obviously, and this is important, especially in the United States, it's like a very nasty situation because the right wing of the country is very much against academic freedom, and it's against free speech, and the place of the universities as and academic freedom, and their hostility to that is a very serious issue in the United States. And there is a degree to which they're using the anti-Semitism that's prevalent on campuses for as ammunition for this project. I think Deborah Lipstadt, who wrote the big book on David Irving, who's famous Holocaust denier, commenter on anti-Semitism, author on anti-Semitism, Jewish author on anti-Semitism, talks about how there is an I haven't read her article, but I've seen the catchphrase for it, or not the catchphrase, what's the word? The abstract for it, basically saying that, like, yeah, the two things are exist at once. There is an anti-Semitism problem on college campuses, and the far right Trump administration is trying to instrumentalize the fact of that, which is a real fact, not a made up fact, in order to delegitimize higher education in general. So it's a very um, upsetting political development. Anyway, in a country that dedicated an entire museum to the Holocaust, which claims to be at the forefront of the fight against anti Semitism, three university presidents who form the world's imperialist elite are reluctant to clearly condemn calls for the genocide of Jews and invoke the quote context to do so. It is easy to see why the American far right and Holocaust deniers have a bright future ahead of them with such academy bureaucrats. Yeah, watching that video is so fucking upsetting. It's like really depressing. My question would have been, and this may be, I'm obviously, not like I would ask these people, ask them any on any other topic related to race or gender, um, and ask if they still feel comfortable saying it depends on the context. Like if someone on campus was saying you know saying something extremely racist, I don't think they would say, well, it's not directed to individuals. I think they would clearly set off alarm bells. The quote anti-Zionist or quote decolonial and quote Jews are among the most determined militants to explain that Zionism and fascism are twin brothers, thus taking up an old antiphon of the Communist International from the first nationalist pogroms committed in Palestine in 1929 and 1936, and of the Stalinists. This was used during all the political trials and purges in the USSR and the people's democracies against Jewish communists or Stalinists, but also in daily, quote, communist propaganda when dealing with Zionism and the so-called, quote, Jewish question. The, quote, Tzedek, the decolonial collective, and quote, writes, quote, Zionism is a racist, colonial, and ethno-nationalist project whose structural links with anti-Semitism are increasingly apparent. We see this particularly in the unconditional support of extreme right-wing movements around the world for Israel's colonial and apartheid policies. End quote. On the one hand, these partisans of, quote, decolonial, end quote, theories ignore the fact that many neo-Nazi, quote, nationalist revolutionary, end quote, and neo-fascist groups and leaders, starting with Francois Duprat, one of the ideologues and founders of the Front National, who went so far as to create in 1967 a movement for the liberation of Palestine, end quote, have also been supporting the Palestinian resistance for decades. This is true in Germany as well. I think there was a group called Anti-Zionist Action, which was of the right. I think also the Munich massacre, which 11 Israeli athletes were killed, was organized not in collaboration with the German radical left, even though people on the radical left, like Ulrike Meinhof, celebrated it as a great act of humanity when the Israeli athletes were executed. But it was planned in collaboration with the far right of Germany. Also, I think important in Germany as well, and maybe he'll say this as well, I don't know, but there's the, I can't remember his first name, but the Hoffmann, like, military sports group or whatever it translates as, which was a far right militia in Germany that was responsible for murders. There was something called like the Beer Hall, or like maybe it was the Oktoberfest massacre in like the early 80s. And also like they killed like a rabbi and some other people. But they also they trained with the PLO in Lebanon. Um, and just like if you just think of like the Entebbe raid in Idi Amin's Uganda, Idi Amin was a very very well known celebrant of Hitler. Um, and could not be called a left-wing figure by any stretch of the imagination. That's falling outside of the context of Europe a bit, but um, right-wing anti-Zionism is almost never talked about. Back to the text. We need only mention French militant groups like the GUD and a Bloc Identitaire, supporters of the, quote, white jihad, end quote, influential ideologists and agitators such as the American David Duke, the French Dieudonné and Alain Soral, the Russian Alexander Dugin, the Belgian Jean Thiart, and countless far-right anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic websites, blogs, and Facebook groups that have a mass influence. On the other hand, they are unaware that their apparently brand new, quote, decolonial rhetoric echoes the prose of Stalinist ideologues. Before I get into that, I want to look at least this one person up. Francois Duprat. Wikipedia says Francois Duprat was a French essayist and politician who lived from 1940 to 1978. Was a founding member of the Front National Party and part of the leadership until his assassination in 1978. Duprat was one of the main architects in the introduction of Holocaust denial in France. Back to the text. On the other hand, they are unaware of their apparently brand new, quote, decolonial, end quote, rhetoric echoes the prose of Stalinist ideologues such as K. Gerezin, who wrote in something in Russian, Novo Vremya, as early as 1946, that, quote, in the hands of the reactionary leaders of the Zionist movement, the Yishuv settlements have been transformed into an instrument of racist hate propaganda and chauvinism, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Asmund Borgen Gierda's M.A. in History, 2011, reinterpreting Soviet anti-Zionism, unquote, an analysis of, quote, anti-Zionist texts published in the Soviet Union, 1967 to 1972, published available at the academia.edu website. And footnote. V. Skurlatov, quote, biological racial doctrines according to which human beings are divided between the, quote, chosen people, unquote, on the one hand, and the goyim on the other, have been transformed into an official state ideology and policy in Israel and South Africa, where, quote, inferior individuals are forcibly separated from, quote, superior individuals. This is apartheid, end quote. Footnote, the following quotes are taken from Stan Crook's study, The Stalinist Roots of Left-Wing Anti-Semitism. According to Stan Crook, we could also quote Zionism in the Service of Anti-Communism, published in 1972, by V. Bolshakov, We Pass Judgment on Zionism by M. Davidov, 1973, International Zionism, History and Politics, V. Skurlatov, 1975, and the pamphlet of Evgeny Evsev, Fascism Under the Blue Star. Evsev was the nephew of Boris Ponomarev, chief of the International Department of the CPSU, Central Committee from 1935 to 1936, and an ideologue who later became active in the nationalist anti-Semitic group Pomyat during the 1980s. End footnote. R. Brodsky and Y. Schulmeister, quote, Zionism, the official ideology and policy of the ruling circles in Israel, create a racist state which oppresses the people of that country and represents a constant source of danger for its Arab neighbors, ... Racism also underlies Israel's domestic policy, end quote. And that quote is from Zionism, a Tool of Reaction, published in the Soviet Union in 1976. D. Sulfer, quote, Israel and South Africa share a racist ideology and practices, as well as a reactionary domestic and foreign policy, ... The union between Israeli and South African racists represent a major threat to the African peoples and to humanity as a whole, end quote. The Collapse of Zionist Theories, 1980. KGB agent Yuri Ivanov, the Pope of, quote, Zionology, end quote, parenthesis, sick, exclamation point, published a book in Moscow in 1969 entitled Beware of Zionism, exclamation point, which took up the conspiracy theories of the protocols of the Elders of Zion by evoking, quote, a very convincing picture of the Israeli variant of apartheid, the cruel racial discrimination against the Arab population, end quote. And even the French Stalinist turned Muslim and Holocaust denier Roger Garaudy, quote, this, quote, ethnic cleansing, end quote, which has become systematic in today's state of Israel, is based on the principle of ethnic purity, which prevents the mixing of Jewish blood with the, quote, impure blood, end quote, of all others, ... This racism, the model for all racisms, is an ideology of domination over different peoples, end quote. Roger Garaudy. Today in the, quote, decolonial writings of the Tzaddik Collective, it reads, quote, Zionism integrates and extends the racial logic of European modernity. It seeks to turn Jews into white people like everyone else, to emancipate Jews through the same mechanisms that oppress them. In this process, non-European Jews have the status of candidates for whiteness, and Palestinians constitute an alien and unassimilable body, end quote. Apart from the mere, quote, trendy jargon, where is the political difference between Stalinist prose and fashionable, quote, decolonial Lagoria? I've put up several things from the author Ingo Elba on here, which is a critique of anti-Zionism through the lens of understanding a lot of contemporary anti-Zionism's theoretical foundation, which is post-colonial and decolonial theory. And if you think of like one of the main proponents of decolonial theory, Walter Mignolo, he very much is a person of a pro-Russia and pro-China persuasion, which without doubt is like a modern remnant. That attitude of anti-Westernism coupled with like a reverence for like Russian civilization or something is like a residue, definitely a residue of left-wing totalitarianism, Stalinism. Anyway, he views them as like not as what's the word? Not as colonies, but civilizational states or something like that. Or that's how he talks about like Putin's Russia. So I think there very much is like an overlap, and it's not just a a similarity. It's like almost like on a number of issues. Footnote. Excuse me. Where am I? Where am I? The American Stalinists, among others, claimed as early. This is a footnote. The American Stalinists, among others, claimed as early as September 1932 that, quote, the Zionist movement, end quote, was, quote, cultivating racial hatred, end quote. Quoted in Henry Srebrenik, in the article, an enemy of the Jewish masses, a quote, an enemy of the Jewish masses, end quote. The ICOR and the Campaign Against Zionism, 1924 to 1935, end quote, published in A. Grabsky. And footnote. 6. Hamas is said to be a national liberation movement, and its genocidal intentions should not be taken seriously. The quote arguments, end quote, are manifold. The genocidal project contained in its charter has disappeared following the adoption of the Document of General Principles of Policy of 2017. If you read that, the original Hamas charter, it's like, it's not even, there's no room for doubt. And also, it's like, people with like that inhuman of a politics don't suddenly just change heart. It's definitely an instrumental move to make when they made their updated charter more politically correct. And I believe also that there's like quotes of like the Hamas of people, the top Hamas like officials and other documents saying like, oh yeah, the principles in the original charter remain sound, which definitely cites the protocols of the Elders of Zion as like a primary source document, saying the Jews started World War I, World War II, the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution, and so forth. Anyway, sorry, footnote. According to Jean-Paul Chagnolot, director of the Institut de Recherche des Études Méditerranéennes, Moyen-Orient, quote, Hamas has committed heinous crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, but as a nationalist movement, it has nothing to do with Daesh or Al-Qaeda. It represents, or largely represents, a good third of the Palestinian people, end quote. I was talking, and I'm not an expert on it, but I was talking to people about whether Hamas coming to power was a coup or not, or whatever. It's definitely, and they were saying, oh, they were democratically elected. I feel like what I was saying, I mean, I'm not, they might be right, I'm not the expert. But on that particular aspect of like history in the history of Gaza, but that makes if Hamas does indeed have popular support, that doesn't speak well for the Palestinian people. That's very bad. Yeah. So what was I gonna say? Oh, never mind. I forgot what I was gonna say. It doesn't matter. There have been countless polls and articles in the left-wing press claiming that Hamas's popularity soared among Palestinians after the massacre of the 7th of October. And again, if that's true, that doesn't speak well to Hamas. That speaks against the Palestinian public and their politics. And I don't think you get, and people will talk all the time about, well, like so many Israelis, they keep electing Netanyahu. Kind of definitely do it as like a way to like dehumanize Israelis, but they would never do that with Palestinians. I don't think they should, but I'm just saying like that, like they wouldn't like, there's always a weird relationship. Just as a side note, there's always a weird relationship between nation states and like people, because on the one sense, national self-determination is not the same thing as human self-determination, and that's like just a principle of good, like nationalist critique of nationalism, nationalist ideologies from like a cosmopolitan internationalist left-wing perspective. But at the same time, I feel the when people talk about states and stuff, they talk about states too often as either like states are like the direct representatives of people, like or like the representative of the people, or like there's kind of like a synonymity, is that a word, between states and people, and then there's the other one that says there's nothing to do with the state and nothing to do with people. Like Israel has nothing to do with Jews, has nothing to do with even with Israelis, um, uh, and Hamas has nothing to do with the Palestinian people. Either of those two arguments, there's kind of like extreme arguments of like, the relationship between national entities or any of any kind, state entities of any kind, and their people, is not cannot be talked about. I don't think can be talked about in such simple terms. Anyway, back to the text or end footnote. The quote arguments are manifold. The genocidal project contained in its charter has disappeared following the adoption of the Document of General Principles and Policy of 2017. Hamas, quote, is characterized by a doctrinal flexibility, end quote. Quote, Hamas is not of one piece, neither in its history, nor in its social and political surface and practice, nor in its ideological positioning, end quote. The political wing is at odds with the military wing. Hamas has fought, quote, passionately, end quote, against other more radical armed factions such as the, quote, Islamic State of the Levant, end quote. Hamas not only remains, quote, Hamas not only remains open to power sharing, but also has a history of nonviolent accommodation and political occupation, a political adaptation, ideological flexibility and transformation, and political pragmatism that the West should welcome positively, end quote, etc. And that is a quote from Sarah Roy, Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, published in 2013. The Trotskyist NPA #1 press release of the 9th of October 2023 is quite symptomatic. It begins by stating that, quote, the political and ideological project, the strategy and the means of struggle of Hamas are not those of the NPA, end quote, but offers us no further explanation. Then it continues, quote, in this context we condemn the killing of civilians by Hamas. The Palestinian resistance is made up of forces with different political projects, end quote, which doesn't get us very far. The Trotskyist NPA #2, which publishes Revolutionnaire, the journal, has been a little clearer. In its 12th of October 2023 issue, it denounced Hamas as a, quote, reactionary and obscurantist organization, end quote. And its, quote, large-scale attack, end quote, a very neutral term. But for these militants, the real culprit was the Israelis, quote, the Israeli civilians who are the victims of Hamas attacks and rockets are suffering the consequences of decades of their state's racist, segregationist, and colonialist policies, end quote. The emphasis is from Yves Coleman, when I repeated the suffering the consequences. Moreover, quote, apart from a small minority of opponents of Israeli state racism, end quote, the Israeli demonstrators opposed to the Netanyahu government's judicial reform, quote, did not defend the rights of the Palestinians, nor denounce the misery in Gaza and the West Bank, nor the military colonization operations in territories officially granted to the Palestinian people, end quote. In other words, the Israelis have been punished by Hamas, including the massacred Thai and Filipino workers. A month later, under its pen, the 7th of October massacre is almost forgotten and reduced to a simple, quote, blind attack, end quote. In any case, the ambiguous position of these activists who regret that, quote, we don't see anyone raising the Palestinian question on class grounds, end quote, is not at all that of the ultra-majoritarian Hamas-compatible left. Supporters of the Hamas-friendly left are much more likely to recognize themselves in the statements of Norman Finkelstein. On the 8th of October 2023, at a meeting on Zoom, Finkelstein spoke of his, quote, parents who were in the Warsaw Ghetto up until the uprising of April 1943, end quote, and pointed out that, quote, the uprising in the ghetto is normally regarded as a heroic chapter, or the only heroic chapter of the Nazi extermination, end quote. All this is to reiterate his admiration for Hamas, but without daring to name it. Quote, every nook and cranny of Gaza is under 10,000 different Israeli surveillance technologies, and yet they, bracket, quote, they who, Yves Coleman, end bracket, managed amidst all this to block all the surveillance and conduct this operation. I pay tribute to that ingenuity. I pay tribute to the resistance of people with literally or almost literally having figured out a way to resist this concentration camp imposed upon them or overcome it, end quote. Norman Finkelstein. The they is clearly Hamas. And this is another thing that's just like they as in let's say if someone says Palestine, the Gazans or whatever, they make a radical separation between Hamas and Gaza. But in this instance, whenever there's a resistance, it's the resistance of the Palestinians. However, his Jim and Stumbeck Substack colleague, Muin Rabbani, had no hesitation in declaring on the same day, quote, there are reports which appear to be increasingly substantiated that there was a mass casualty event at a rave that was being held in the Negev desert. ... But if there was indeed a deliberate attack on a civilian gathering with the explicit purpose of causing mass casualties, I would have two observations. A, that's a despicable thing, and B, Palestinians would be entirely justified in treating any condemnations coming from people who have no record of condemning the crimes perpetrated against them, of treating those condemnations with utter contempt, end quote. Wikipedia says Muin Rabbani is a Dutch-Palestinian Middle East analyst specializing in the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestinian affairs. As of 2012, Rabbani was based in Amman, Jordan, and was senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, the Palestine director of the Palestine American Research Center, a project director for the Association of Netherlands Municipalities, and a volunteer and general editor of Al-Haq. Rabbani was a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies, a co-editor of Jadaliyah, and a contributing editor to the Middle East Report. Back to the text. So Norman Finkelstein already knew on the 8th of October 2023 that it was very likely that dozens of Israeli civilians had been killed the day before, even if the information came from the diabolical Israel. But Finkelstein preferred to keep quiet for many days until he was forced to publicly admit that he had not measured the scale of the, quote, atrocities, end quote, Finkelstein's word, committed by Hamas, ... But all the while, Finkelstein continued to make the same essentialist speeches about the, quote, Israelis being all guilty, as in his face-to-face meeting with Alan Dershowitz on the 13th of December 2023. On this occasion, he brandished the Israeli far-right electoral results in very recent polls in Israel to explain that the majority of Israelis were in favor of Tasahal continuing its war crimes. And the question is, at least from my perspective, not this is Coleman's perspective at all, but like, what is its war crimes? Uh, but what means war crimes? Obviously, I wouldn't dispute obviously that war crimes were committed, and maybe even genocide you could say was committed, right? Depending on, um, the semantic use of that term, could be, could not be. Uh, Genocide is far more than just killing a lot of non-combatants. There's more. There's like genocide, in my view, has a more precise definition. Obviously, you can kill a lot of civilians and stuff like that, and I wouldn't. I would consider it maybe. I would consider it a war crime, but not as genocide. Like you might say, like the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atom bomb. That is definitely a war crime, and a lot of Japanese people were killed. But I don't think you couldn't call that a genocide. I wouldn't call it a genocide against the Japanese, especially considering that once the Japan was defeated, to my understanding, the occupation, whatever you think of the occupation, didn't like amount reprisals on Japan, and Japan has since had a very close relationship with the United States. So I don't know if you could call it. I don't think you could call like the bombing of Hiroshima or like the fucking devastation of Tokyo, for instance, as genocides. They almost definitely were war crimes, but they were not genocides. For people like Finkelstein, I would speculate that any kind of military action against the Gaza, against the rule under the rule of Hamas, would be considered a war crime. Any response whatsoever would be considered a war crime. People were saying genocide before a single thing was happened. People said genocide before October 7th. All that. So it's a thing to think about. It's like also it's like genocide. It's like, okay, you're killing a lot of people in a particular place, yet I think what's it, the joint list. I'm not sure. I might be wrong. I could be talking my ass. This is serious stuff, so you should consider that. You should think that I'm talking out my ass. So I don't know, but like I believe that the Arab political party is the third largest party in the Knesset. I don't know if he still is, but one of like the main, one of like the Supreme Court justices in Israel was a not Jewish. It was an Arab Palestinian of a non-Jewish persuasion. Was like, I don't know, like whether you can say it was like a genocide, like genocide. You know, it's difficult to say. I don't know. Obviously, disregard for the civilian population is tricky, and especially when like Hamas definitely 100% does use like the human shield thing is not made up, as already discussed in this earlier with that piece from that quote from the group from Brazil. Um, yeah, and it's like it's the same thing with like if you talk about like the communist experience, right? Stalin murdered a lot of people, um, and especially in places like Ukraine. Ukraine's a little bit more well known, but also like places I think like other republics within the USSR, other locations within the USSR also were subject to like a disproportionate level of famine, even though famine was generalized in the countryside in the push to collectivize the peasantry. Um, Obviously, and the obvious. So was uh was the Holodomor a genocide? I have no doubt that like it's not a question about figures whether you call it a genocide, right? Um, it's not like, oh, you have certain numbers of people who died, therefore it's a genocide. Um, but like one of the things with that is that the very next person to replace Stalin was Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian. Um, is that mean? Was it like an ethnic? Like they're, and then it's like there's talk of like, and I think it's true to my understanding. I want to say it's true to what my understanding. There is some deliberate um, um, brutality executed against in the Ukraine in collectivization against like uh, nationalist or independence aspirations on the part of Ukraine. Not exactly sure, but like were those people being killed? I mean, not that it matters in the end of the day when they're dead, but like were those people being killed as Ukrainians for being Ukrainians, like ethnically Ukrainians? I don't know. That's a question. Same thing with like Mao Zedong's like Great Leap Forward, where like Mao Zedong definitely holds the record for killing the most of his own population on the part of a state. Like I'm pretty sure that's like established record. We're somewhere between like the low estimates are like 15 million people starved to death, but some people will say like almost as much as like 50 million. I think the Chinese state says 20 million. Um, Either way, like lots of people starved to death uh, by the state. The state killed a lot of people directly from its policies. Obviously, this wasn't just in the case of like murder, but it was um, reckless industrialization policies. That was kind of like um, the earmark of a lot of the deaths that happened in the communist states, right? Um, uh, like I don't know if you'd call the Great Leap Forward, which killed so many people, genocide, right? It's not disputing the figures or numbers, and just like the same thing when you're talking about whether what's happening, what happened. It's, at this point, there's the ceasefire or whatever. It's the 14th of October, 2025. But when you're talking about whether it's a genocide, it's not like it's a little bit of a semantic thing about what you consider genocide to be, and semantics matters. Semantics isn't like a derisory. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter what you call it or whatever. It definitely does matter, and um, and that's why like I'm like cautious. Like I feel like I'd be cautious about saying genocide, even though like um, other people that I respect call it a genocide, just because it's such a politically charged like issue, because it was like already people were saying Israel was doing a genocide against the Palestinians or against Gaza before October. Um, the 7th of October, before the latest escalation of the Gaza war. Um, yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's a very, uh, like, so it's a very difficult to say, like, what is political. And especially in, like, the UN, like, what's her name? Albanese or whatever, the special rapporteur for the occupied territories or whatever, is straight up anti-Israel. There's no like she's not an impartial evaluator of this situation, but definitely uh, uh, an extreme anti-Zionist and uses all the rhetoric of decoloniality and all of her things. So it's like hard to like piece out because the use of the word genocide is very much to uh, there's definitely much a fighting word um, in order to delegitimize not just a government but an entire state in this case. Um, so it's difficult um, to say. So like, sorry, I just started riffing to myself. So I apologize, but yeah, I was just thinking about uh, obviously Israel is like whether or not it killed a lot of people recklessly, at the very least, and definitely is guilty and has been guilty in the past of war crimes. I'm just saying right now that it's like, you know, what would be a war crime in the eyes of Finkelstein on or like which I think in my mind would just be continuing to exist, any kind of defense at all. Um also as if like the surveillance that Israel engages in has nothing to do with actual real security concerns and it's just made up. Um, as if there wasn't all this security, um, like something like October 7th wouldn't have happened already. Um, whatever you want to critique of like security, um, it's just like a general concept or whatever. Like uh, you know, yeah. Anyway, moving on. Sorry about that. Such contortions by an international, quote, anti-Zionist and, quote, idol like Finkelstein can only be explained by a blind faith in the virtue of the so-called, quote, national liberation, and, quote, movements and discrete capitulation to their reactionary orientations in accordance with the old Stalinist and Third Worldist ideologies. Yeah, as if in the past there was nothing wrong with the national liberation movements in like a deep way. Um, I think that sorry, so talkative. But like I think one of the big things that's always super interesting, I would say that like the core of American leftism, this like actually like radical left, at least in America, and I would probably say for large parts of like the Western world, its core assumption that it shares its core like value, almost like attitude and disposition, um, is anti-Americanism and pro-national liberation, pro-national, pro little guy nationalism. So you have this weird thing where like anarchists, who would like, criticize Lenin or the Bolsheviks, rightfully, feel some kind of like affinity for, uh, you know, uh, Vietnamese Stalinism or Stalinism internationally, um, which were like oftentimes not didn't even have the chance to have a Stalinist degradation. Were Stalinist right out of the gate. Um, like all the revolutions, all the communist revolutions were really Stalinist revolutions. So it's like a weird thing where it's like anti-Leninism mixed with like Lenin really sucks, but like Ho, what about Ho Chi Minh or like the Irish Republican Army or something? Any of those kinds of things, like when it comes to class politics, and I'm talking about like I guess right now I've tried to change subject matter without really saying it. But like you think about like anti-authoritarian left is like they're kind of like I don't know, at least in the United States, oftentimes pretty pro nationalist, just anti-American. They're anti-imperialism over everything else. Almost exclusively anti-American imperialism. That's like the shared ideology of like the libertarian left versus like and the Stalinist left is just against the hegemon. Um, and so yeah, so there's just kind of like I would say, and I don't know how this is in France, but generally like very very uncritical, positive, affirmative attitudes towards anything coming out of the third world that opposes um, Americanism, not Americanism, but the United States. It's kind of like almost knee jerk, as if like as if like the United States' enemies over the past large swaths of its like the recent in the especially even during the Cold War, but even like after have been extremely reactionary forces, um, whether it be Al Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS or Saddam Hussein or any of those people were not like were not terrible, or Russia today, um, like straight up like autocracies had nothing to do with socialism or anything like that, or maybe they had some kind of tentative relation, some kind of like quasi relationship to socialism, um, in terms of particularly in terms of like state-centered development, if you consider that to be like what socialism's all about, is the development of the productive forces under nationalized control. Um, But but yeah, this is a shared thing, and I think this is just like I feel like sometimes the new left is talked about it as something was in like the '60s and '70s, but I really don't think it ended at all. Um, Especially and people like to talk about the good side of the new left, the De Boers, the situationists, the Marcuse, Frankfurt School kind of things. But like really, there was very much like two new lefts. One which was, you know, the new left of like the self management new left, you might say in the longest in the largest terms, and the nationalist new left. And sometimes they overlapped, and sometimes they didn't. But there was definitely like uh, um, the new left is generally considered to be like some kind of departure from Stalinism, and it absolutely was not. Except the Stalinists that were most prized were not European. Anyway, sorry, fucking Yves Coleman puts these videos. I've seen put some of these videos on his website, which is where I'm getting this from. And he shares the recordings. It's like I feel bad for him if I feel kind of, that being the case, I feel bad because I'm fucking ruining his essay. But anyway, just talking to myself. Um. Anyway, 7. In the past, national liberation movements have also resorted to terrorist attacks. The Hamas-friendly left cites the examples of the Algerian FLN and the Vietnamese FNL, which also killed civilians individually as part of terrorist attacks in cafes, etc. Side note, the Vietnamese Stalinists also killed the left opposition. Check out the work by No Van on that sordid history of leftism, and also check out Lauren Goldner when talk in the critique of Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air, where he talks about like confronting Orthodox Trotskyists about their just complete ignorance or ignoring of Vietnamese Stalinism's repression, murderous repression of the left opposition there. Anyway, the Hamas-friendly left cites the examples of the Algerian FLN and the Vietnamese FNL, which also killed civilians individually as part of terrorist attacks in cafes, etc. And so to criticize Hamas is to retrospectively support French or American colonialism during the 1960s and 1970s. This is yet another example of one of the techniques used by the identitarian left wing when it comes to any subject in which you disagree with them. And it's also like the Vietnamese FNL and the Algerian FLN. I think, or both of these instances, the distinction, very much so, is that for one, the Algerian and the Vietnamese armed struggles were not trying to destroy France or to just in either capacity or destroy the United States, right? At least not in any direct sense. Maybe as part of like a global communist flag assault, USSR Soviet assault or something on the West or something, whatever. But like their main, as those national liberation starts, they were looking for sovereignty within in their places. They weren't trying to wipe another state off the map, right? To and especially like and that's important consideration, right? And that's like, and it's also like what's the word? Like the goals of like Hamas or whatever, not just to have some type of Palestinian state. It's to wipe out Israel, full stop. To wipe out another state, not just to have sovereignty. Like it's a and also like Israel, while colonizing or occupying the occupied territories, and definitely, with the settler movement that it encourages, is like has an expansionist quality, and also people who call for like a greater Israel or like annexations and all those things definitely have a expansionist quality, which is not exclusive to Israel by any way. Any of the like the post-colonial states also have these problems about expansion and so forth. It's not something exclusive to Israel, yet no one would call these other states imperialist or whatever. What was I gonna say? But yeah, it's I was gonna say that I feel like there's something very much distinct about, particularly the question of armed Palestinian groups and these other groups, in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And this is yet another example of one of the techniques used by the identitarian left when it comes to any subject on which you disagree with them. 8. Hamas is not responsible for the killing of civilians or the rape of women. The arguments vary, but they all tend to exonerate Hamas. This is an Israeli lie. Footnote, according to Izzat al-Risk, a member of the Hamas political bureau, quote, those in charge of the Zionist terrorist occupation continue to spread lies and use the platforms of the United Nations, the Security Council, and international institutions to spread lies and deception about the noble resistance of our Palestinian people, who draw their high moral standards from the teachings of our religion, our values, and humanitarian law, end quote. As for Ghazi Ahmad, a member of the Hamas political bureau who was interviewed by the BBC about the murder of civilians in their sleep in their homes, he immediately interrupted the interview to avoid answering. End footnote. There's also a footnote that I appear to have missed. Footnote. This is a Norman Finkelstein quote. Quote, I was not aware that the numbers had been beyond 50 when I made that statement, end quote. On the 7th of October, he told Piers Morgan on the 23rd of November. Quote, I did not make another statement until the numbers start to grow, and I admit it was a moral quandary for me, end quote. Well, if we check his Substack on the 12th of October, when Israel announced not 50 but 1,200 victims, he was not really in a rush to solve his so-called, quote, moral quandary, end quote, because he remained silent this day and preferred to talk about 19th century anti-slavery revolts than denouncing Hamas. End footnote. And this is the other part, this is like on this list of things that these arguments. There are many groups in Gaza other than Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and even independent mafia groups, which may also have taken advantage of the confusion to take hostages and may be responsible for the worst abuses. The murders and rapists were drugged by Captagon. What the hell is Captagon? It's a new one for me. Some type of amphetamine. According to Norman Finkelstein, this is a, quote, open question, end quote. At least that was his opinion until November 23. To put it plainly, since the Israeli government always lies, as long ago as 1543, Luther published a, quote, treatise titled On the Jews and Their Lies. Since we have to wait for the results of an investigation that will take a long time, let's give Hamas the benefit of the doubt and wait, ... Wait for what exactly? Note that the far left, and indeed the French left, adopted the same wait-and-see opportunist attitude when Ilan Halimi was tortured and killed in 2006, and when Mera murdered 3 children, and an adult at the Ozar Hatorah School in Toulouse in 2012. Footnote: at the time, Christian Piquet and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, members of the Parti de la Gauche, today La France Insoumise, a left-wing nationalist populist party, were very cautious and were waiting for the results of police investigations. See also the left identitarian PIR, which is Peoples of the Indigenous Peoples of the Republic, or something like that. A group inspired by the theses of Ramon Gros-Fuguel, among others, a decolonial or post-colonial scholar at Berkeley, who said I believe, to my recollection, made a number of troubling comments in the wake of October 7th. The Trotskyist Lutte Ouvrière, or the English neo-Trotskyists of the Socialist Workers' Party, who took seriously the, quote, pro-Palestine and, quote, motives of the murder. And footnote. Wikipedia says the murder of Ilan Halimi was the kidnapping, torture, and murder of a young Frenchman of Moroccan Jewish ancestry in France in 2006. Halimi was kidnapped on the 21st of January 2006 by a group calling themselves the Gang of Barbarians. The kidnappers believed that all Jews are rich, repeatedly contacted the victim's modestly placed family, demanding very large sums of money. Ilan Halimi was held captive and tortured for 3 weeks and died of his injuries. The case drew national and international attention as an example of antisemitism in France. Back to the text. Let me look this up. The Toulouse and Montauban shootings. The Toulouse and Montauban shootings were a series of Islamist terrorist attacks committed by Mohamed Merah in March 2012 in the cities of Montauban and Toulouse in the Midi-Pyrenees region of France. He targeted French army soldiers as well as children and teachers at a Jewish school. In total, 7 people were killed and 11 more wounded. Merah, a 23-year-old French criminal of Algerian descent born and raised in Toulouse, began his killing spree on the 11th of March, shooting an off-duty French army paratrooper in Toulouse. On the 15th of March, he killed 2 off-duty uniformed French soldiers and seriously wounded another in Montauban. On the 19th of March, he opened fire at the Ozar Hatorah Jewish Day School in Toulouse, killing a rabbi and 3 children, also wounding 4 others. After the shootings, France raised its terror alert system, Vigipirate, to the highest level of the Midi-Pyrenees region and surrounding departments. Merah, who filmed his attacks with a body-worn camera, claimed allegiance to Al-Qaeda. He said he carried out his attacks because of France's participation in the war in Afghanistan and its ban on Islamic face veils, and justified his attack on the Jewish school because, quote, the Jews kill our brothers and sisters in Palestine, end quote. Merah was killed on the 22nd of March by a police tactical unit after a 30-hour siege at his rented apartment there, during which he wounded 6 officers. His brother and another man were later convicted of taking part in a, quote, terrorist conspiracy, end quote, over the attacks, which were condemned by the French Council of the Muslim Faith, the United Nations, and many governments around the world. Back to the text. And let's not even mention the murders of Sarah Halimi and Muriel Knoll, 2008, which the same Hamas-friendly left classified as, quote, miscellaneous incidents, end quote, committed by, quote, deranged people. Wikipedia says, Sarah Halimi was a retired French doctor and school teacher who was attacked and killed in her apartment on the 4th of April 2017. Circumstances surrounding the killing, including the fact that Halimi was Jewish and that the assailant, Kabili Touré, had shouted Allah Akbar during the attack and afterward proclaimed, quote, I killed the shaitan. Leader of the devils in Islam. Cemented the public perception, particularly among the French Jewish community, that was a stark example of anti-Semitism in modern France. For several months, the government and some of the media hesitated to label the killing as anti-Semitic, drawing criticism from public figures such as Bernard Henry Levy. The government eventually acknowledged an anti-Semitic motivation for the killing. The assailant was declared to be not criminally responsible when the judges ruled he was undergoing a psychotic episode due to cannabis consumption, as established by an independent psychiatric analysis. The decision was appealed to the Supreme Court of Cassation, who in 2001 upheld the lower court's ruling. The killing has been compared to the murder of Muriel Knoll in the same arrondissement less than a year later, and to the murder of Ilan Halimi, no relation to Sarah Halimi, 11 years earlier. Muriel Knoll lived from 1932 to 2018, was a French Jewish woman and Holocaust survivor who was murdered in her Paris apartment on the 23rd of March 2018. The murder has been officially described by French authorities as an anti-Semitic hate crime. And yeah, just as a side note, the double standard here of kind of like portraying these things as miscellaneous incidents committed by, quote, deranged people. Whenever any tragedy like this happens, and the person is a piece of shit in the sense of being a white supremacist or a misogynist, they always emphasize the political nature of the acts. But in this, I mean, I don't know. I can't speak about France actually, so I'm talking in my ass. But in the United States, where there is like, or just the little world, like in Norway and what's it, Christchurch and all those places, and what's it, New Zealand, like they all have what's the word? They all have an analysis of like their like the politics of these things, right? And it's like there's, instead of like attributing these fucking these lone wolf attacks as like incidents of like derangement or extreme mental health crisis, they view that as like a cop out, and I think it is a cop out. I agree with them on that, but I also think it's a cop out to just say these are deranged people in the case of Islamist anti-Semitic murders. Anyway, until the Hamas-compatible left knows the truth about the 7th of October 2023, the Islamists can continue to kill the Jews with impunity. 9. Sahal also killed Israelis by mistake on the 7th and 8th of October 2023, so how do you know who killed whom? In France, the Hamas-compatible left and others are keen to highlight these examples. They take refuge in, quote, complexity, but only when it suits them. They prefer to believe Hamas, or at least not to criticize it too quote, harshly, end quote. There's a softer but equally... Did I say footnote? No, I didn't. Sorry, moving on. There's a softer but equally cowardly variant of the same attitude. There are war crimes on both sides, and since there are far more war crimes on the Israeli side, parenthesis, including the military and settlers, end quote, than on the Palestinian side, we must concentrate on the crimes committed by the IDF and Israeli settlers. This purely quantitative reasoning most often results in Hamas's war crimes being downgraded to regrettable and unintentional, quote, collateral damage, end quote, and Israel's war crimes being upgraded to a, quote, proto-genocide, end quote, or even a deliberate, quote, genocide. Footnote, according to the, quote, eco-Marxist, and, quote, icon Andreas Malm, as early as 2021, see Matthew Bolton's article, Climate Catastrophe of the Zionist Entity and the German Guy, an Anatomy of the Malm-Joppa Dispute. If you're curious about that, I recommend checking out what was I saying? Check out the piece. I have that piece on the channel by Matthew Bolton, and check out all the pieces by Matthew Bolton, coming at the critique of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I don't think he's necessarily pro-Zionist or anything like that, but like the critique of anti-Semitic discourse about Israel from a critical theory perspective, he's from the United Kingdom, I'm pretty sure. Unless he's from some other place where they don't speak American. Anyway, end footnote. This, quote, quantitative argument has a certain, quote, logic. Quote, since Israel is the only state whose overthrow is demanded by any strand of the progressive left, these must in the nature of things be worse than any that can be alleged against any other presently existing state, including, to name but a few, the present administration of Myanmar, where there is a genocide. No one on the left talks about it, just as no one talked about, or like the majority of the left did not talk about, like Assad, North Korea, or Iran. I don't know if this is sorry, let me repeat that. I interrupted myself. This isn't like a quote. It doesn't seem like it's a quote from a person. This is like a recitation of an argument. This, quote, quantitative approach has a certain, quote, logic. Since Israel is the only state whose overthrow is demanded by any strand of the progressive left, these must in the nature of things be worse than any that can be alleged against any other presently existing state, including, to name but a few, the present administration of Myanmar. You think also they're murdering Muslims in Myanmar, North Korea, or Iran. Quote. I'm not sure. I think I just saw headlines. But what was I gonna say? I think in Iran they recently were either they have or in the process of or did deport like I'm not sure, something like 2 million Afghans or something like that. I'm not sure the number. That might be a miscellaneous number. For some reason I feel like 2 million's in my brain, but that might be, it was like a lot of Afghans. I don't know if that was followed through on or what happened to that, but I have seen that said. Like recently they did this in like a headline. I don't know if that's true or not, or any details about it if it is true. In fact, I think this actually was a quote. This quote is from a piece by Bernard Harrison, Fathom Long Read, Political Anti-Semitism Explained. Anyway, and this is underlined and in bold. It is this asymmetry and respect for human life and compassion for the victims of these clearly asymmetric battles that poses a problem. It is this asymmetry and respect for human life and compassion for the victims of these clearly asymmetric battles that poses a problem. In conclusion, the groups on the left or far left which support Hamas do not want to condemn it, quote, don't want to condemn it too, quote, harshly, which amounts to the same thing. Believe that everything the Israelis say is a lie and propaganda, Just as Holocaust deniers have always claimed that the Allies lied about the Judeocide, and that all historians of the Judeocide were fabricators, or better still, agents of Israeli influence. When you're in such a state of denial, no amount of evidence or argument will change your mind. This time, the left-wing Holocaust denial no longer involves a few ultra-marginal individuals, as it did in the 1970s, but tens of thousands of left-wing activists and sympathizers supported by academics and media intellectuals. Such Holocaust denial, which draws on a fund of ancient anti-Jewish cliches, can only encourage the spread of anti-Semitism from the left to the right, from the extreme left to the extreme right. Footnote. On the program Rien ne va on Al Jazeera Plus, the quote comedian Abdel asked a classical anti-Semitic question, quote, how has Israel infiltrated the French media?
Quand je regarde la télé française et que je vois comment est traité le génocide à Gaza, à Israël.
Shit, lost my spot. Where the hell am I? Such Holocaust denial, which draws on a fund of ancient anti-Jewish cliches, can only encourage the spread of anti-Semitism from left to the right, from the extreme left to the extreme right. And all those who denounce, quote, the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, end quote, are blatant hypocrites. And all those who denounce the, quote, instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, end quote, are blatant hypocrites if they have never taken seriously the many anti-Semitic murders committed from Bagnoud 2006 to Toulouse 2012, from Paris 2015 to Brussels 2019, from Halle 2019 to Pittsburgh 2018, from San Diego 2019 to Jersey City 2019. To conclude, I would like to quote an article by Bernard Harris, a philosopher whose political positions I probably do not share, but who clearly analyzes the causes and consequences of the Nazification of Israel at the heart of most, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, discourse. What has largely replaced that older Marxist left is a left which frames the vices of capitalism less as the exploitation of the working class than the malign domination of a multitude of marginalized and excluded groups, ... It stands, therefore, in need of a cause that simultaneously galvanizes its supporters, gives it positive access to the media, and at the same time explains its failure to gain wider support, ... Israel can be readily represented as typifying the supposed essential commitment of capitalism to colonialism, Nazism, and the exclusion and exploitation of the non-white other, while at the same time, the machinations of the, quote, Israel lobby can be advanced as a ready explanation of the failure of the ideas of the left to gain more ready purchase at the highest levels of power. It is precisely at this point that the lurch into political anti-Semitism of these sections of the progressive left takes on the potentially lethal, militantly anti-Jewish tinge, ... If the radical BDS supporting left really believed that Israel is a, quote, Nazi, quote, apartheid, quote, colonialist, or, quote, racist state, it would have a manifest duty to attack not just Jewish supporters of Israel, but the very much larger body of non-Jewish supporters of Israel, ranging from American evangelical Christians to very large numbers of conservative and centrist labor supporters in the UK. But in fact, ... those under attack are Jews and only Jews. Of course, one is also tarring non-Jewish supporters of Israel with the same brush, an equal absurdity. But they, the non-Jews, can be conveniently excused as fools misled by the all-powerful, quote, Jewish lobby as, quote, dumb goys. That is to say, as Norman Finkelstein once called the editor of this journal, for example, he's referring to Alan Johnson, the Jews have no such escape. They stand identified by the BDS supporting left in the terms made familiar by political anti-Semitism in all its lethal manifestations, ... As an alien nation gives over to the pursuit of evils only to be remedied by its summary elimination. That this racist nonsense should be not only believed but actively promulgated by large sections of the supposedly anti-racist left would be extraordinary if it did not have such a long history in Western movements aiming at the political or religious redemption of society. It is also manifestly criminal, end quote. Bernard Harris. And that's the end of the piece by Yves Coleman, published in Ni Patrie, Ni Frontière, 15th of December, 2023. There's a footnote that I missed. It said, note that in order to be invited to the, quote, media, a channel very close to the social patriotic nebula of, quote, France Insoumise, all you have to do is sing this song as shown by the frequent presence of members of the Tzedek, quote, decolonial collective, end quote, on this, quote, news medium. I guess media is a specific, referring to a specific outlet.